HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Moment of Liberation in Western Europe, Power Struggles and Rebellions, 1943 to 1948, by Gerd-Rainer Horn, read by Michael Page. Introduction. The moment of liberation in Western Europe forms the end point or the starting point of countless history books, for good reason. The final end of a murderous total war constitutes a logical marker in historians' attempts to make sense of the past. This book takes a rather different approach. The moment of liberation is here understood as a roughly 5-year-long period which formed a distinct era on both sides of 8 May 1945, the official date of the termination of hostilities in the European theatre of World War II. It includes the final months, indeed up to 2 years, of war, occupation and resistance, but also up to 3 years, depending on location and circumstance, of the post-liberation period. What unites the years from roughly 1943 to roughly 1948 is a series of events, designs, actions and hopes which, taken together, gave this moment of liberation a peculiar flavour. To be sure, the end of the war, which wrought unimaginable destruction of lives and the material infrastructure of what was left of European civilization, was uppermost in people's minds as the key goal to pursue. Accordingly, the defeat of the Nazi army and the corresponding liberation of occupied Europe naturally played a crucial inspirational role for their respective political and military engagements. At the same time, the wish for such circumstances as had given rise to total war and Nazi occupation terror in the first place to never happen again emerged as an additional, increasingly powerful mobilizing motivation for large numbers of Europeans who had been fortunate enough to survive. In this book, I will consistently refer to activists in resistance organizations, whether military or civilian, as anti-fascists. I do so knowing full well that not all members of resistance groups would have identified with this label at all moments, or even at any, during their period of active engagement. Anti-fascism is a term encompassing a wide variety of political orientations and action repertoires. The lowest common denominator was the desire to put an end to specific national fascist regimes and or Nazi Germany's or Mussolini's Italy's domination over one's native lands in the cases of resistance activists operating in occupied Europe. How to go about doing so was subject to widely differing ideas and conceptions, depending on whether activists emerged from democratic, anti-capitalist, anti-military, religious or pacifist milieus. And Jens Späth, in a cogent recent contribution to the ongoing discussion of the parameters of anti-fascism, justifiably adds, after all, such contradictory groups as, for example, communists and conservatives all assembled under the umbrella of anti-fascism. As I will explain in greater detail in my conclusion, anti-fascism not only came in many colours, but it also underwent a considerable evolution over time. First emerging in the cauldron of post-World War I Italian politics in the run-up to the appointment of Benito Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy in October 1922, fascism and anti-fascism took on transnational importance with the designation of Adolf Hitler as German Chancellor in January 1933. With the lightning military victories of German armed forces after 1 September 1939, fascism and anti-fascism became key issues of European and world politics for the duration of World War II, though anti-fascist sentiments underwent yet more serious developments in the course of the 5 years and 8 months of this murderous conflict. Pervasive patterns of collaboration in all occupied countries by eager local assistance to the Nazi enterprise on a daily, years-long basis had convinced many Europeans, as the moment of liberation appeared to be approaching, that the defeat and eviction of the Nazi overlords was a necessary but not sufficient measure to fulfill their dreams. A post-war order from which fascism, war, occupation and terror would be banished for good was seen by many, almost instinctively, as a society in which the powers of traditional economic elites were massively reined in as well. Having often staked their lives to combat the Nazi scourge, along with various associated local quislings, in the moment of liberation countless individuals had grown increasingly contemptuous of the pre-war status quo ante. The prophetic insights offered by the doyen of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, then living in exile in New York, penned in an obscure émigré journal in the very first days of what turned out to become World War II, "Whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about fascism," had unexpectedly but persuasively become common currency in the popular imagination of many denizens on the war-torn European continent by the mid-1940s. This book is an attempt to reconstruct the potentially system-transforming energies of anti-fascism at the moment of liberation in continental Western Europe. For, by the time liberation appeared on the horizon in 1944 and 1945, expectations of the concrete contours of the desirable post-war societies had risen to untold heights. The moment of liberation in Western Europe had inadvertently but inexorably become one of those rare and unpredictable moments of crisis and opportunity which, on occasion and in irregular appearances, leave their imprint on the society, politics and culture of their day. In my 1996 European Socialists Respond to Fascism, in part inspired by certain discussions of closely related ideas by other social theorists, I first employed the concept of moments of opportunity to describe these brief incursions of peculiar social and political constellations when everything seems possible. Whereas opportunities for radical societal change in any direction are narrowly prescribed in the vast majority of historical moments, such rare instances do occur. When they do appear, predictions of the immediate future are outdated soon after they are made. In 1944 and 1945, the contours of post-war European society were seemingly up for grabs. In hindsight, of course, we now know that the moment of liberation in Western Europe in 1944 to 1945 brought to an end the long nightmare of fascism, but it did not bring about the end of capitalism, though it was not for want of trying. As the various chapters to follow will hopefully suggest, and as I will discuss in somewhat greater detail in my conclusion, the moment of liberation at the tail end of World War II may well have been the conjuncture of European history which could fittingly be described as the nadir, the absolute low point, of the popular acceptance of capitalism as a desirable social system in the 20th century. The peculiar conjuncture of a quasi-continental years-long battle between fascism and various forms of anti-fascism in the context of a terrifying and murderous world war had convinced a growing number of Europeans that the moment had come for fundamental social change. The ensuing chapters will concretize the pathways chosen and the most important battles lost and won. Another salient feature of this particular moment of transnational change was the fact that, quite often, the various sentiments expressed by grassroots activists in occupied Europe could not benefit from much meaningful coordination on a national or even regional level, let alone on a transnational scale. Yes, indeed, the issues facing anti-fascist activists from Athens to Amsterdam and from Palermo to Paris were in many ways remarkably alike, but the ferocity of Nazi oppression rendered meaningful and effective overall control of operations by anti-fascist activists the stuff of utopian dreams. Each unit of the resistance, whether civilian or military, in the last analysis had to rely on its own forces above all else. Yes, there were, of course, connections made, calls to action spread, and supplies and directives distributed, measures which gave some credence to the notion of anti-fascist resistance activists forming part of a powerful national and even transnational social movement. But anti-fascists, finely dispersed throughout occupied Europe, operated in the last analysis with limited concrete links to like-minded activists elsewhere. Ultimately, all too often, they were thus left to their own devices. Yet what obviously in some very important respects constituted a major handicap, in other ways provided a powerful example showcasing the independent and autonomous social power and political clout of anti-fascist resistance in particular and mass-based social movements in general. By force of circumstance, the anti-fascist moment became one of those rare, almost textbook-like moments in history when, for practical purposes, no single organization, no matter how beholden to centralized Jacobin ways of doing politics, could truly dominate or manipulate the many individual manifestations of a powerful social movement operating in any given region or country, let alone on an international scale. In other words, anti-fascism provided a laboratory of social and political action in order to study what large numbers of people may want or what sorts of visions of the desirable future society they may create, if there is no one in authority to tell them what they should want. Resistance activists were forced to rely on their own inventiveness and power for most phases of their engagement in social and political action under the Nazi yoke. It is, therefore, in my view, all the more remarkable that anti-fascists in many locations, certainly where resistance had become a veritable mass-based social movement, came up with astoundingly similar ideas and practices. Later we will hear that grassroots forms of democratic representation, most often termed liberation committees, saw the light of day in the most remote locations of Europe in the process of liberation before, during, and after liberation itself. And, of course, the similarity of experiences affected more than merely the forms of effective and efficient political representation of the various anti-fascist currents in locations throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. The moment of liberation is a perfect occasion to study the inventiveness and creativity of social movements in a specific moment of crisis and opportunity, which is how the years 1944-5 presented themselves across almost the entire continent of Europe and in significant other portions of the world, above all in East Asia. In my prologue, as a teaser of sorts, I draw attention to a relatively little-known incident precisely at the moment of liberation in a part of Germany where, at war's end, neither the American nor the Soviet armies occupied a relatively populous stretch of territory, inadvertently leading to the de facto creation of novel institutions of self-government. Such liberation committees, in Germany they were then most frequently called Antifa-Ausschüsse, were far more widespread and pronounced in France, Italy, Yugoslavia and Greece, where they had emerged already earlier under rather more promising conditions, though with widely differing concrete manifestations of such phenomena. Chapter 1 reconstructs the turbulent and much neglected history of the French variant of these organizational innovations, liberation committees. They constituted, within the limits imposed by circumstances, the most democratic instances of popular representation available in the tempestuous months prior to, during, and above all in the aftermath of liberation. Unsurprisingly, they also fashioned the most serious challenges to the return to the pre-war status quo ante in Republican France. Chapter 2 draws attention to the powers, the functions, and the history of identical institutional innovations in Italy. In Italy, however, the challenges to traditional forms of government were yet more widespread and deep-going than in France. Chapter 3 casts a detailed glance at liberation committees on the factory and office floors in Italy and France, with a brief discussion of the explosive powers of such grassroots democratic structures at the moment of liberation in communities of poor peasants and landless labourers. Chapter 4 should be understood as a case study of the promises and perils of the moment of liberation in the influential field of journalism and the production of information and ideas. Here the story told is a tale of the massive changes affecting ownership, management, and the editorial lines of the crucial daily newspaper press at the moment when liberation finally arrived, and the amazing efficiency and rapidity of the return to the pre-war status quo ante. Chapter 5 points to what I regard as the last stands of the radical resistance spirit, long after the liberation committees, which form the essential target of my attention in chapters 1 to 3, had disappeared. An important word of warning about what is not covered in this monograph. This book is no general history of the moment of liberation in Western Europe. A comprehensive survey of the vicissitudes and ultimate outcome of this era would need to address at the very least 4 additional topics: the largely non-existent purges in all areas of political and economic administration in post-war Western Europe, the role of the Allied presence throughout much of the continent at the moment of liberation, the fundamental continuities of economic and political elites, minus its Jewish components, in Western European societies, and a concentrated view of the role of the most important political parties within the anti-fascist camp in this era. To do full justice to these 4 features of the moment of liberation would have required much additional research and, in fact, for practical purposes, a completely separate research agenda. It would also have required a doubling or even tripling of the size of this monograph. I had neither the time nor money to carry out such extensive additional archival forays, nor did I wish to produce an even more voluminous study, which, correspondingly, fewer individuals would be likely to ever really read. On the role of the Allies and some political parties, certain sections or comments in this monograph will suggest my train of thought. Thus, for instance, I am more convinced than ever that, in the end, Allied policymakers played a decidedly secondary role in shaping this tempestuous conjuncture. This is not to be confused with the obviously primordially crucial role of Allied military engagements. Civilian politicians in the countries under study were primarily responsible for the choices made and the pathways taken. Had French or Italian politics at the moment of liberation taken a more radical turn, then perhaps the role of Allied military governments would have become more proactive. We will never know, for there was no need for such potential interventions on any larger scale. The choice to focus on liberation committees and associated radical experiments has ultimately much to do with the red thread which has formed the leading motivation for all my historical work. I wish to spend my energies not primarily on betrayals and defeats. I wish to point out and highlight instead crucial instances in the history of 20th century Western Europe when disadvantaged and subaltern population groups, i.e. the vast majority of Europeans, have attempted to chart an independent course of action in the direction of a qualitatively different world. Prologue. Republik Schwarzenberg. It is still an unresolved question why it happened. But literally in the closing moments of World War II, when the American and Soviet armies converged in central Germany, the impossible occurred. A stretch of German territory with roughly 500,000 inhabitants in the southwestern reaches of Saxony, from the foothills of the relatively industrialized Erzgebirge all the way to the borders with Czechoslovakia, roughly halfway between Chemnitz and Karlovy Vary, remained unoccupied by either the American or Soviet armies for more than 5 weeks, in some cases up to 7 weeks. From 8 May 1945 until mid-June or even later, 2 Landkreise and 2 towns, Aue und Schneeberg, were left to their own devices. At some point at the beginning of this unusual moment of military and political vacuum, virtually every single community in this Niemandsland had pleaded with American commanders of units stationed just to the west to include the Landkreise Stolberg and Schwarzenberg in the American occupation zone, but to no avail. In fact, some parts of this semi-rural, semi-industrialized Niemandsland had been liberated by American troops, but they subsequently withdrew to leave the baffled population to cope on their own. Red Army units stationed further east likewise abstained from any involvement in the civil affairs of the Niemandsland until mid-June, when they began to slowly make their presence felt following an agreement with the American side on the division of the territories they had conquered in central Germany. The inhabitants of this Niemandsland were thus forced to tackle the administrative and political challenges of the initial post-capitulation days and weeks all on their own. The curious case of this Niemandsland is thus a tantalizing case study of what a population decides to do when forced to rebuild their lives by themselves, when there is no higher authority present to tell them what to do. For up to 7 weeks, the administration of the Niemandsland became a laboratory experiment of self-administration. Of course, the circumstances of such an enforced self-government were not exactly propitious. The last surviving member of the new makeshift local government of Schwarzenberg, Paul Korb, recalled in 1995, "In the castle and in several schools lingered about 1,000 injured German soldiers. In pubs and factory halls about 6,000 refugees and homeless. Because of bombing raids on cities nearby, Dresden was a mere 60 kilometers away, had found temporary shelter. Several thousand prisoners of war and forced labourers lived cramped lives in nearby camps." Destruction of houses, public buildings and civilian lives in the Niemandsland itself had been relatively limited, but the challenges of organising daily life and the survival of 500,000 people were, as can be easily imagined, manifold after 12 years of Nazism and 6 years of total war. For one thing, the local Nazi administration was, initially, relatively intact. Still, as late as 9 May, 10 May and 11 May, entire units of the Wehrmacht marched in unison fully armed through Schwarzenberg. The power of the Nazis had not been conquered. Nonetheless, public order began to disintegrate. Regular channels of food supply had vanished. Theft and pillage became rampant. Isolated houses and farms became particular targets for plundering. The area had undergone a certain industrialization in earlier decades and indeed centuries. Thus the workers' movement had been relatively well represented up to 1933 in what by May-June 1945 had become the Niemandsland. Paul Korb continued, "What could we anti-fascists do? I spoke about this with 2 comrades on the morning of 11 May in the Wildenau neighbourhood of Schwarzenberg. We planned for a discussion on this issue with others. We then met in the forest near Bermsgrün, 6 men and 2 women from Schwarzenberg, 2 Social Democrats, the other 4 Communists. Our deliberations lasted barely a half hour. The result? Back to Schwarzenberg in order to mobilize other anti-fascists and to procure arms, to occupy City Hall by that evening, also the local headquarters of the Gestapo, the regional Nazi Army command post and the Brown House, the building of the local NSDAP, to disarm the Nazis and to arrest their leaders, to make contact with the forced labourers stuck in their camps." At 10 p.m. that night, about 100 armed blue-collar workers invaded City Hall and arrested the policemen and members of the armed civil guard, a force created by the Nazi mayor of Schwarzenberg in the final hours of the Thousand-Year Reich. The next day, 12 May, a 15-member action committee, eventually called the Anti-Fascist Action Committee, addressed the town's population in an open letter. Between 8 May and 15 May, in many locations in the Niemandsland, similar anti-fascist action committees were formed in most locations of some size. On 23 May, a central regional action committee located in Schwarzenberg capped the system of enforced spontaneous self-government. Importantly, this regional action committee, Bezirksaktionsausschuss, was elected by the local action committees, and these grassroots organs of self-government retained the statutory right to revoke and re-elect their coordinating committee in Schwarzenberg for the duration of this experience. The members of the various local action committees represented anti-fascist public opinion on location, notably Social Democrats, Communists, Liberal Democrats, and individuals without any party political affiliation. Often great care was taken to ensure equal representation by locally present and active political organizations. In the important population center of Aue, by June 1945, Communists, Social Democrats and Liberal Democrats each received precisely 10 seats on the local Aktionsausschuss. Initially, the Aktionsausschüsse attempted, where possible, to cooperate with the Old Town administrations in order to face the multiple and daunting recalibration of public order and attendant seemingly insurmountable tasks. But within about 2 weeks the committees saw themselves forced to unseat most of the old guard town officials in important positions of power. From the beginning, however, the action committees had assumed executive powers in terms of political decision-making, denazification, and the replacement of compromised individuals, and thus gradually more and more key positions were controlled by the new authorities. The former and future Minister of Saxon Regional Government, the Social Democrat Alfred Felix, concisely described the political situation in the Niemandsland towards the end of May 1945 in the following terms. In the absence of any form of national government or superior authorities, today the Landräte and the mayors are the sole traditional officials on location. But these authorities now obtain their executive and legislative powers from the action committees, which have replaced the traditional regional and local political powers until new regulations for the administration of Germany have been determined by an eventual decision of the Inter-Allied Control Commission. The Action Committee is now the incorporation of public power, police powers, and administrative legality. Its decisions call for unconditional obedience. Its decisions are even binding for the Landrat. The affinity of this dense web of action committees with forms of direct or grassroots democracy, a timeless and vibrant tradition of the workers' movement, which even a dozen years of Nazi terror had not been able to excise from living memory, is further substantiated by the frequent recourse to general assemblies in many locations in the Niemandsland, where sometimes rather important decisions were taken, such as the election by secret ballot of a new mayor in the village of Erla. When the Allies by mid-June decided to assign the Niemandsland to the Soviet occupation zone, the Action Committee's time was up. The Soviet policymakers were no more inclined than their Western allies to foster, or even to tolerate beyond the necessary minimum, experiments in democratic self-government which bypassed and contravened traditional structures of political and administrative hierarchies. From mid-June 1945, the action committees began to be sidelined and marginalized, if not outright dissolved. Leading activists were integrated into the newly revitalized traditional administrative structures of a given locality, usually in consulting positions. Some survivals of the erstwhile action committees eked out an existence for more than a year. Nowhere in the Niemandsland did the action committees actively resist their effective dissolution, no doubt at least in part because of their keen awareness of their total isolation in a post-capitulation Germany, where the four allies held total power. Antifa-Ausschüsse in Germany. The spontaneous emergence of such action committees was by no means a peculiarity of the Niemandsland. The sole distinctive and decisive feature of anti-fascist action committees in the Erzgebirge region centering on Schwarzenberg was their assumption of effective local and regional powers, if by default. Elsewhere in Germany, at the point of capitulation, liberation, similar organs emerged as well, with an amazing and surprising regularity. Their adoptive label differed from case to case, with the term antifaschistische Ausschüsse or Antifa-Ausschüsse perhaps the most common denominator. Without exaggerating their, on the whole, marginal role in most locations at the point of liberation in Germany, their presence did make itself felt in countless cities, large and small. Their membership was, on principle, very similar to the political spectrum assembled in the Niemandsland committees. The entire spectrum of anti-fascist underground public opinion was represented, with a notable preponderance of activists belonging to the erstwhile, pre-1933, popular parties of the workers' movement, social democracy and communism. Time and time again, however, individuals from the rather tiny left socialist or dissident communist tradition played a disproportionately important role in the establishment of such Antifa-Ausschüsse. But their effective role in the reconstruction of public life and public policy was almost uniformly marginal. With few exceptions, leaving aside the Niemandsland, Their designs far exceeded the constraints of political and military circumstances at the point of liberation capitulation in all 4 occupation zones of defeated Germany. Jeanette Michelman highlights the exceptional cases of the small or medium-sized towns of Pirna, Schmiedeberg, Meissen and Waren as locations where, even if just for a limited time, Antifa-Ausschüsse effectively replaced traditional local governmental structures. Rebecca Berling, in her important study of Frankfurt, Stuttgart and Munich at the moment of liberation, in which she notably draws attention to the work of the Antifa-Ausschüsse, concludes with similar observations on the origins, meaning.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?